Okay. So for MSS students, we'll have some online workshops for you to do at home fitness. And for non-students, we'll let you know when we have these discussions and lectures. Uh, Hopefully, there will be one every week or so. All right. So let me start by introducing Arik. Arik has been doing martial arts since 2001 and historical fencing since 2008. His initial focus is Giganti, Nicoletto Giganti, which is rapier style. He's also branched out to Bolognese, Destreza, Fiore, as well as Wing Chun Kung Fu. Second, more people are joining in. All right, so he's he studied a bunch of texts to help him dominate the tournaments within the SEA. I have seen this in person, so I can tell you that it is true. He has kicked my butt countless of times, and other people's as well. All right, so he's won many tournaments, sort of a tournament headhunter in the SEA, in the Kingdom of the Middle, which is the Midwest. All right, Arik, I'm going to leave it up to you. You may start.
Wonderful. Thank you for the very generous introduction. Yeah, so I'm currently calling in from Chicago. I've been to Canada a few times. I hope to be there more so in the future. I'm really happy to talk with all of you about swords. So with that said, we're going to get started on the presentation itself. Great. So welcome to Dueling in Renaissance Italy and Germany. This is just kind of the two areas I've focused on in my study of the larger history of this, not so much the martial systems, particularly for Germany. So we're going to see an overview. This doesn't mean that dueling wasn't happening in other places, right? The idea of ritualized combat is in no way unique to Europe. We're just going to look at like a couple ways that it was done, primarily in the 16th, early 17th century in Italy, and then the sources of Kung Fu for Germany, or at the time it was called the Holy Roman Empire, are a little later 16th century to like mid 17th century. So there's this idea out there. I got it from this author. His name is Rory Miller. If you ever get the chance, read some of his books, called Social versus Asocial Violence. So violence is a tool, right? Like I'm not a particularly violent person. Folks who are violent are doing so for some sort of reason, right? So asocial violence is essentially like someone's mugging you in the street. The point of this violence is to get your money or to like do something bad, right? Like they're really there to get a thing and then just kind of leave. Social violence is a display, right? So asocial violence you're gonna like see in an alley or right where people aren't in a place where there isn't an audience to play to. Social violence, so if like you ever see people get in a bar fight where like they're puffing their chests out and making a big show of it, right? That's social violence. They're trying to assert dominance. They're trying to like, explain a thing. Or like in a prison setting where like a beat down in prison is to teach someone their place. It's not so much to like get their money. I'm sure there's also those instances, but like in that specific example. So dueling is very very much so social violence. Even when it is a quieter affair, that the point of it is to prove your standing in the rest of society and explain why you're a just and upright citizen and why the other person isn't. Right? It isn't just I want to murder a person. So the main theme of today is going to be honor. The folks we're pulling from in Renaissance Europe, right, are all reading Aristotle or at least reading secondary sources on Aristotle. Aristotle is like the driving force for contemporary thought back then. He gives us this nice quote, right? He has a larger idea, so my degree is in philosophy of like virtue ethics. So instead of it being like an ends-based system where you're just trying to save the most people, right, there's a bunch of particular virtues that one should aspire to. So the idea of honor has changed a bit throughout history. The Bryson is an author I'm pulling from a bunch. There's a bibliography at the end. So it's important to note that like your standing in honor, right, is weighed against a few other options. Right, you might have obligations to your household. You might have obligations to your specific lord, right, like whether they're the local baron or the count or the prince or the king, etc. Right, and it's not always, the person you're serving isn't always the head of the country, but you also have obligations to the country. Honor is seen as something that's so important at this time that it supersedes all of that. So if someone threatens your honor, you have to go stand up against it, right? Even if it's bad for all of the other people in this picture. So for instance, right, dueling, incredibly dangerous, especially in a pre-modern era in regards to medicine. Right, swords are sharp, gangrene is everywhere. Right, the chance, let's say like you're a soldier, right, in contemporary Western militaries, we like tend to encourage our soldiers not to get into into fights with each other that can easily get themselves killed. That isn't what we're seeing at the time, right? Even though it's bad for your country, for your officer, for your brigade, right? Because you're like instilling disagreement, and also you might die, and now you can't help anyone, right? Even if you might die and you can't provide for your family, defending your honor is seen as more important than all of those things. We'll get to this in a little bit later, but like we often see in like movies these days, the two guys will start fighting, and this is all like a very male thing. We have like a couple instances later on in history of women in the West getting into duels, but it turns out people like in the 16th and 17th century were incredibly patriarchal. So all of the talk about honor is just targeted towards men. So like we'll often see nowadays the idea of like two guys get into a fight and like their girlfriends or wives like, oh no, don't do it. That isn't what's happening. Right? Everyone around you is pushing you to have this fight. Right, we have a bunch of ideals around what this fight is, but we do have some contemporary accounts. Morozzo, who's one of the Bolognese authors, kind of tells us that like the idealizations of honor we're getting from Aristotle and other folks, and the reality we're seeing on the ground aren't always the same, right? Like people aren't always conducting themselves with knightly virtue, just as anyone who's ever, right, you've all been around for a minute. I'm sure I've joined lots of organizations out there where I was like, this will be a great idealized place. And I was like, oh, okay, it's filled with humans. Right, like I saw this guy on YouTube for a bit who was took a few years and like studied at the Shaolin Monastery out in China. And he's like, surely this would be a place where free of political intrigue. And he got there and he's like, oh, cool. They also have power dynamics. So it is important to remember that even if we're talking about these idealized forms of protecting your honor, humans are humans, and we haven't really changed much. Like our diets got a little better. That's really it. So your social status plays a pretty big role into who is getting into these duels. So noble titles matter a little more earlier on, right? By the mid-16th century, we're starting to see this huge blossoming of the middle class. Lots of, right, the focus has shifted from I'm a noble, I own land, and thus I have all the money, to I'm a merchant and I'm in charge of a business that actually run. I don't just have someone do it for me. I have all of the money. I just don't have a title. But even within that, right, there's still very important social standings. So if I am of a class above you and you challenge me to a duel, right? If we are of equal status, I really couldn't turn it down. There's like a few exceptions, right? We have a rule, for instance, in several of the cities in the Holy Roman Empire of if you are so old you require a cane to walk, you are no longer allowed to carry a sword, right? So like if you're of this age, like you made it this far, congrats. You don't have to get into any duels anymore, even if someone's rude to you. Um, but right, so like if someone is a lower status of me, so if like some peasant on the street is hurling insults at my lady, and I am like a proper gentleman, I can just ignore them. But if another proper gentleman does the same thing, or we're at a party, I have to go deal with it. So there's a lot of defining who is right on the inside and who's on the outside. Right, as well, you have like some military rank stuff going on as well. Right, like there's also different professions. So certain professions are seen as higher and lower than the professions. These aren't always tied to income. There's a great book out there about the life and times of an executioner in like late 16th, early 17th century Germany. And even though he's in the top 5% of earners for his city, he's considered of a low social status because he deals with these bloody things. Like, no one likes the executioner. He didn't wear a hood or anything. They all like knew who he was. And then, of course, right, the big other of medieval and Renaissance Europe are my people, the Jews. So if you were Jewish, and this depended a bit on what city you're in, but overall, you often weren't allowed to come to another city and wear your sword. So you could like hang around your own city, and that's fine. But if you show up to another city, you'd have to hire a local, which also presumes you have enough money to do so, to be your bodyguard. Remember, this is an incredibly armed society, right? If you are a gentleman, emphasis on man there, right? You are walking around every day with a sword at your hip. You likely taken a couple fencing lessons. Not everyone is really good at it, but right, in the same way that nowadays, like if you are of a certain class in the business world, you probably know how to play golf. I don't know how to play golf. I'm not that fancy of a businessman. But, right, not everyone is expected to be Tiger Woods, but, right, all the C-level employees, right, like your CEOs, etc., expected to know how to play golf, right? All of the men of this era, or the upper class men, just know something about how to fence, right? They all own swords. Largely, the swords are fashion statements, but they are sharp, and they can murder people. So certain groups are excluded from that, right? And Jews are consistently portrayed as the other. So like if you, and also like oftentimes the judicial process would be separate. So the word ghetto, for instance, that we, at least in America, will often use for like the poor area of a town, comes to us from the Italian, from the Venetian ghetto, right? It was a specific area of town, often walled off, that the Jews lived in. And it was fairly commonly, right, not all the time, the policy in these areas of like, if two Jews are getting into a dispute, the secular, aka Christian authorities just kind of let the Jewish courts deal with it, right? And if two Christians got into a dispute, the Jewish courts didn't really care, right? It gets a little funky when you have Jews and Christians getting into fights, which we have a couple accounts of, but right, these ideas of honor are very much coming from a Christian, European-centered idea. And when you have this weird group who's here, like hanging around, they're not entirely sure what to do with them. So they're kind of like, just like women and low-class professions, Jews are considered exempt from this whole honor thing, right? As well, children, the text on that, whatever, are considered exempt. That doesn't necessarily mean that fights couldn't be started because of children, but like the words of a man saying a thing that would get him into a duel. If a child said it, right, it'd be like, okay, like this is a kid. I'm not going to hand him a sword and make him kill someone. That said, right, the idea of the hearth is really important, right? The idea of the homestead. So if someone is saying something bad about your kid, or your kid is misbehaving poorly, you as a man, or as we have lots of women in the audience, but again, I'm just kind of referencing the texts we're reading from, have to go defend that or have to go deal with it. But like, children are getting into duels, women aren't getting into duels. Doesn't mean that there wasn't violence involved in their lives, right? There's lots of corporal punishment. We have accounts of women getting confessed with each other, but it's more like using household objects. So, for instance, like everyone kind of had just an eating knife on their belt all the time. So, like people would pull out knives or hit each other with like pots and pans, but they aren't getting into aristocratic. We have our seconds. There's a sword involved. Duels in this period, as a general theme. There are always exceptions. The other important thing, this is one of my favorite photos because, like, if you're fighting 4 people, this is your strategy that Hunt gives you: is chuck your sword and run. So we have the dueling list and the battlefield. Right, these are the 2 areas where most of this violence is happening. And like war is much more present in people's lives in this day than it is now, right? Like there has never been a war on the soil of the country I have lived in during my life. Same with my parents, right? That's not a thing people could have said back then, unless they were really young and their parents were really young. Right, in the early 16th century, you have the Italian Wars. In the mid 17th century, you have in the Holy Roman Empire the 30 Years' War, because it implies it went on for a while. Right, war was like a pretty present concept. Add to that, like the fractured political nature, there's lots of internal military conflicts. Right, Italy isn't a country until what, the 1860s, 1880s. Germany, as we know it, isn't a country till 1871. So there's a lot of like loosely aligned nation states that don't always get along with each other, as opposed to like large countries like America or Canada that we have now. So battle like was pretty present. There wasn't as clear a distinction between soldier and civilian as we do now. That said, the way they saw it at the time, fighting on the dueling list was considered of a higher honor than fighting on the battlefield. These things are very much attached to each other. We're going to see that a little bit more when we look more at Germany in a minute. But the idea behind this was, if you are in a battle and you lose, this isn't necessarily a reflection of you, right? You could just be unlucky, right? The wind could have gone this direction and your arrows went away, or your enemy got the surprise on you, or your commander made a poor choice, right? The outcome of a battle isn't dependent on any one soldier, and they aren't going to be judged for it. In a duel, right, it's a one-on-one fight. If you lose, that was you. Like, there's not a lot of fault, right? There's a ton of effort going into making it so that we have, right, even odds on both sides, right? I'm sure like certain people are better fighters than other people, but outside of that, right, the weapons are the same. They're often of the exact same length, whether you're on horseback or not, right? You're both either on horseback or not on horseback. Right, the ground is generally pretty level. One person doesn't have like the high ground against the other person. They would inspect the list beforehand. Right, both sides seconds would inspect it to make sure that there weren't any like traps or holes in the ground that couldn't be easily seen. Whereas like a battle, even like a big pit, like a stage pitch battle, like the nice Hollywood kind, where back in the day you agreed to where you're going to have this fight. Even with that, even though most of it was like siege warfare, is going to be a lot less uneven in its own nature. So even like circling back earlier, we talked about the duty to your country or to your lord or to your family, right? Those things aren't considered as high as your personal honor. And this is a very Renaissance idea, right? If you go to like the 14th century, they don't really have this notion of honor. Like it's something you either have or you don't. It's not a thing you can lose. Whereas by the Renaissance, if you are dishonorable, right, you can lose that status. So, right, that is seen very clearly on the dueling list, as opposed to like in service of a larger authority. Unless, of course, they're talking about like God, right? So, but everyone is always putting they're in service of that. So, how do we get into a formal duel? So, there's a few different things that can cause this to happen. So this is a list of, and these aren't just individual things that could spur this, but you have to have all of them happen. So the first one, they talk about an injury. This isn't necessarily a physical injury, although it can happen. Right, the movie thing, or the Lincoln's version, where they take off the glove and hit you, like, isn't really a thing people did. It was essentially a like early modern meme. Like it was a joke, but like that's not a real thing. That said, right, like if someone hits you in the face, you can be like, all right, I'm going to see you later. We're going to have this duel. There can also be an injury of words, right? If they talk bad about a member of your household, right, that is considered as injurious as a physical injury, whereas to get to like the 19th century, a physical injury is considered more offensive. It also had to be something said unjustly. So, right, there's a lot of like putting into question the sexual purity of your daughter and or sister and or wife. So if someone said that, and like we all know that by trade this person is a prostitute, it's like not really going to be a duel because like it's not a particularly unjust statement, even if it is really sexist. Whereas like they're like a princess locked in a tower and someone says that, it's going to be worse. So it has to be an unjustified thing. A lot of it's also right revolving around business practices. So if someone calls you a cheat, right, that'll cause a lot of these things. And remember, like the reason there's this big focus on honor isn't just in and of itself. People are generally living in pretty small communities at this point. Most folks live in villages of 150 people, and even in the cities back then. So like, I live in Chicago, which has like multiple millions of people. Medieval cities were in like the tens of thousands. I don't have like the numbers for Renaissance at the top of my head, but like you probably right. A lot of it was word of mouth. If your name wasn't good, and especially there wasn't a ton of social safety net back then, you wouldn't be able to eat. Right? If people didn't trust you to do business well and justly, like this person messed with the measurements, or there's like a lot of, because they're using metal currency back then, it's not as centralized. There's a lot of like intentionally using impurities in your coin, or right, like selling you this piece of fruit, but it's actually rotting on the inside. Right? A lot of this is having to do with business practices. So if someone unjustly comments on your business practices, right? The reason at the end of the day you can't just let that go, because everyone will start talking and they'll go, oh, yeah, that grocer is trying to cheat me out of things. I'm not going to go there. Then all of a sudden, no one's at your shop and you starve. The next thing is that it had to be hard to prove the credible witnesses. So they had a judicial system. Like there were people whose job it was to be lawyers. I'm not an expert on Renaissance like judicial matters. But we have this notion oftentimes that like nowadays, right, we're so much better than they are back then, and they solve their problems via violence, and we solve our problems via courts. And there's some truth to that, but if we could just, right, if it could be easily proved that like, hey, right, I had this contract with someone, uh, and they violated these terms, and they aren't right responding to that. So, for instance, like I ran my own business for years. And there's lots of like, you give me this deposit, and then the day you give me this amount of money. Uh, and I've been pretty lucky that I haven't had clients who've tried to mess with me on that. Like I can go to small claims court uh, if they try and mess me over. Right, there were similar processes back then. So, right, you need a witness. Like, if there's something that can just easily be proved by a bunch of people in the room, like someone made a claim and that is either false or right, etc., the courts would just deal with it. The next is the status thing we talked a bit about. It also has, right, dueling is a very personal thing, right? It's your honor. It's not your like your country's honor or anything like that. We also have, I am very unfamiliar with Canadian law, but I know in like the U.S. Constitution we have this idea of double jeopardy, which I believe we just stole from the Brits, like many things. You can't. Right, we have this idea called double jeopardy. So if you've been tried for a crime once, right, you can't be tried again for the same crime, just they can find you guilty. So, right, if a court verdict went poorly, like it didn't go the way you wanted to, you couldn't just resolve it with a duel. Like it was done. And at the end of the day, right, the other person has to respond to it. They have to issue what is something called a mentita, which essentially is saying is like the other person is a liar. So if Phil is saying something nasty about my business practice and I just let it go, my business might go down, but I'm not going to get into a duel. If I call Phil a liar, now we have ourselves a situation. All right. There's a lot of power play happening here, a lot of positioning, because there's different roles in the duel. So the person, you at the end of the day want to be the person who says you lie, because that person gets to decide the weapon set. Right. So if Phil says something bad about me and I call him a liar, Phil gets to decide the exact time and place. Although if he picks a place that is like overly in favor of him, people are going to judge him for it. Right. If it's like at his best friend's backyard, everyone's gonna be like, that's kind of sketchy. His best friend's probably gonna put something in there. So he has, right, there's pressure on him to find a fairly neutral ground. There isn't that same pressure on me, right? This serves as a check against people getting into duels recklessly, which we see later on. So, like, for instance, leading up to the French Revolution, 1 in 3 French male nobles died in a duel. The French loved dueling so much. The Italians like had it, but like it wasn't like everyone knew someone who had been in a duel. Like if you had been in multiple duels, people would cross the street to avoid you. It's like we have like accounts like Fiore, I believe, was like in a few 3 or 4 duels. I could have that number wrong. I'm not the biggest Fiore scholar. So I want to be the person who says you lie, right? This is a check on people just saying slanderous things. 6, thanks, Aaron. Right, this is a check on people saying slanderous things. Right, so if someone says something bad about me, I can just, right, issue a mentita and make them fight something I know that they're bad at. This is kind of what we see in the famous like coup de Jarnac story. Is one person was like, all right, we're going to do sword and buckler, I'm going to train this one trick really well, and then I'm just going to do it. So if I know, for instance, that, like, I haven't fought Phil in a few years, but like if I know that I am a great longsword fighter, and Phil is an amazing rapierist, but a lousy longsword fighter, sorry to be picking at you, but like you're kind of the common denominator in the room, I'm going to be like, all right, cool. We're going to fight with 2-handed swords. Phil's gonna go, crap. He's gonna hit me in the hand and then poke me in the eyeball, and then it's all going to be over. I've made a terrible mistake. So by giving the stronger power to the person saying you lie, right, this dissuades Phil from just like crapping on my business practices or making fun of my mother. There's different kinds of a mentita. I'm not entirely sure how to pluralize this because I don't speak Italian. I want to say mentiti, but if anyone knows Italian and didn't just take like a month of it on Duolingo, unlike me, feel free to do something with that. Right. Again, like this is kind of a judicial, even though it's outside of the official court system, it is very much a judicial process. It's laid out, it's formalized. We have like more and less serious versions of this, right? The last one, like technically happens. People in medieval Renaissance Europe love fart jokes, and also puns. Oh my god, the 15th century loved puns. So yeah, there's like different kinds of this, and there's a lot of back and forth where like Phil will say something, and I'll call him a liar, and then right because I'm angry, I'll retort with this other thing, and then he'll call me a liar, and then I'll go crap. Now Phil gets to decide the weapons. When you're fighting rapiers, he's going to shank me through the eyeball. I believe Capifero tells you the right eyeball when launching in Quarta. So there's like a few different ways to get into it. Right, on the other side is the cartello. Right, this is the declaration of the challenge. So I'd issue the mentita by saying you lie on the spot. But after this, we're gonna go our separate ways. This is like a drawn-out process. We're going to meet with our seconds, and we're going to have a bunch of intermediaries communicate because we're angry enough we want to kill each other. We're not going to be in the same room. So our seconds are going to run back and forth. Sometimes you'd even have someone of your household stay with the other person, and they'd have someone of their household stay with you for like until the duel happened, just as a security measure to make sure you didn't back out. So Phil, if he's accusing me of a thing, would then have to like publicly issue this cartello. So there's a few different kinds, right? Sometimes they're signed by notaries. Sometimes he wants to stick it to me, right? He has this manifesto where it's like pasted all over, like on the walls everywhere, right? The same way like when you see posters on telephone poles nowadays. Depending on where and when you are, dueling is more or less illegal. It still happened. Certain cities, right? It's like the duel of the century, for instance, in Florence, I believe in the 1530s, like 10,000 people all like showed up to watch this thing. It was like Ansconi and today. I'm sure I'm butchering the Italian. Right, but if you're in a city where it's pretty legal to have duels, posting it like on the walls everywhere, like this person better not run away. I think they did all these terrible things. Fine. If you're in a city where the authorities care a bit more, you're gonna have someone hand deliver them a letter, and you're not gonna be as public about it. So the duel itself, these things could change a little bit, but generally you have about 40 days to train. It isn't, right, this is an aristocratic duel, right? These people were bored and had a lot of free time on their hands. If anyone ever watched Downton Abbey, right, you see like every part of their day is ritualized, and they have 6-hour dinners, and you have to have your red wine glass, your white wine glass, etc. But if your job as an aristocrat, it was to own land. Especially by this point, right, earlier on in history, the aristocratic class were also the knights who were showing up to fight for their lords. By the 16th century, the Italians had so much money they just hired people. So like the Italian nobles got extra bored, and right, so they didn't really have a job. They just had money and time. So they took about 40 days to train, and we have instances, even like going up to the early 20th century, of people showing up on the doorstep of fencing masters and going, hey, I just got into it, like I just signed up for a duel, and I don't know what I'm doing. Help. Giovanni della Gocche, for instance, is writing in Bologna in the 1570s, right, gives us a singular plan to solve this of like, start your sword in your sheath, right, cut up and across your body, thrust down. There's like one other trick. It's like, cool, if you only have 40 days, not a lifetime, you're going to do 2 things, and that's it. So it gives people some time to train. It also gave people time to put all of their affairs in order. So not everyone always had a will set up. So you have to, like, you might die, the other person might die, you might both die. You need to make sure like your estate would go to your favorite child, and that like Shakespeare, like, I don't think got into a duel, but like his will, for instance, gifted his wife Anne Hathaway his second favorite mattress. Why, we still don't know. So if you have anyone you want to gift your second favorite mattress to, you would set that up at this point. Right, make sure like your kids are taken care of, etc., etc. There's 2 locations the duel might occur in. So the first is the Campo Franco, which is generally like your favorite lord's estate. It's going to be a little secluded, right? It's land that someone owns that's away from other people. These aren't things that are happening in the town square. Whereas the other one's alla macchia. So if you, the challenger, issuing the cartello, so Phil said terrible things about me as issuing this challenge, his job is to go find us a spot. If he doesn't have enough friends, because he's the kind of guy who goes around challenging people with duels and saying bad things about their wives, it's going to be a little harder for him to find a Campo Franco, so he's going to essentially find public land, right? Kind of like the Village Green scenario, right? Like a place where people like would herd cattle or whatever. Again, like not in the city square. Inside of that, you have a staccato, which is not to be confused with the thrust. So like where and when you are, we'll define this, but it's essentially like a boxing ring. So it's a bunch of stakes in the ground in a rectangle, which is like whatever specific length, and there's 2 ropes that go all the way around it. Right. This is again a way of controlling this form of social violence. If you're in the ring, that is where violence is allowed to happen. If you're out of the ring, you can't hurt people. That's bad. And in fact, right, if people show up to the duel and violate these rules, part of the second's job was to execute them. Right, you also often have someone adjudicating on top of the seconds, as well as a doctor on hand, right, just to make sure and help out with different things. We have this up until Aldo Nadi's. So Aldo Nadi, like, I think won like the 1904 Olympics in fencing, and like in his book, talks about his account of a duel with sharp epées. Like they have witnesses and seconds and doctors. So like, certain parts of the duel kind of remain intact for a while. And then add to that, there's a built-in timer on the duel. So I'm not sure where Hollywood got the idea from, but we have like this stereotypical idea of the duel at dawn. Might be a later period thing, I'm not entirely sure. But like the 16th century, it's normally a few hours before dusk. And if you're both still standing by the time the sun sets, the affair has been settled and we can all go. Right. This didn't mean we both stood here forever. As part of Phil's job as the person accusing me, he is forced in that role to open the fight with a committed blow. For those of us who have more experience fighting, right, throwing a committed blow is terrifying, and I would never want to do it. So this is again a check on Phil talking smack about me by giving him making his job even more dangerous. Not only is he possibly using an unfamiliar weapon set, possibly being put on a horse that he's not good at riding. Not that I would give him a bad horse, but Phil might not know how to ride, and I might be a great rider. I don't know how to ride horse. But he has to start the fight by giving a committed blow. Eventually, this gets a little more ritualized, kind of hilarious, where people will take the pommel off their sword. Right. They'll unscrew the pommel and then throw it at the other person. right? Because that counts as a committed blow. And even though it makes your sword a little shakier, it's a lot less risky than throwing a cut at their head. This is the duel I was talking about, the dual century. It's this painting. They're actually fighting with case of swords, although the left-handed sword is shorter. So this is like all of City watching them fight. So there's a few different ways to win the duel. Yeah, and them rightly, thanks. Part of it, right? If anyone's ever read like Miyamoto Musashi, one of the duels he gets to in Japan, he like intentionally shows up an hour or two late, just mess with the guy. It's like a psychological warfare thing, and then he wins the duel. If you show up late to a European duel, you're going to get executed. And like your second isn't going to stop them. There's also a lot of places along the way to kind of hop off this train, so the defendant could confess. So before we entered the list, I could go, no, Phil's right, I cheated him. Right, I actually owe him 30 florins. I'm sorry, I was wrong. Right, there's a lot of like the seconds are checking in with like, hey, do you want to be doing this fight? Right, the next, right, we talked about going till sundown. As well, right, those ropes are there not just to contain people, but as well, essentially it's a form of a ring out. Backing up until you hit the ring is a way to go, I don't get stabbed by this sword, was seen to be in really poor taste. It wasn't like cheating where it would get you executed, but if the point here is to preserve your honor, backing up into the ropes is a bad plan. So for those who have done more tournament fighting, where some people's strategy is to just back up indefinitely, in this one specific cultural context, right? I'm not applying this to all sword fights or all time, was seen as a cowardly strategy. It's not that we never step back. So Dalgoke, for instance, tells us that it's all right to take a step back in order to change guards. But if your plan is just keep backing up forever, the people in the room aren't going to look on you well. As well, right, this can go to the incapacitation. Right, this wasn't a duel to first blood. It's kind of a post-Napoleonic thing. It was a duel to incapacitation. So sometimes, like we see in this picture, incapacitation means death. Like this guy dies. If you take a thrust to the chest with 16th century medicine, you might have time to throw a few more blows. And we, even in more modern times, we have instances of people in a knife fight getting stabbed in the heart and fighting for 30 seconds. But they die. So if you're taking a thrust to the chest, you're even like through a wool double, like you're probably going to die in the 16th century. But right, if I step back and cut to your hands, or I hamstring you and you can't stand, or you can't hold the sword anymore, the fight's over. So I didn't have to murder people. And for those of us who've read some more of the texts, right, there's a whole chapter in Morozzo where like he hits a guy in the side of the head with the flat of his long sword, or will like pommel him in the chest, or we'll just like disarm him and kind of throw him to the ground. There wasn't a lot of ground, right? You do see throws, but there isn't really like BJJ ground fighting by this point. Right. As well, right, people have died, and then on top of it, the other option was everyone dies, which sadly happened a lot, and like we see fencing masters lamenting this. It's a really stressful situation, swords are really pointy, and hitting someone once doesn't necessarily mean they are going to stop fighting for the next few tempi. Cool. So that got us through Italy. If you have any questions for everything we've covered so far before we switch to Germany, I would throw them in the chat now. Also, Phil, if you have any questions or want to clarify things, I feel like this is probably a good stopping point before we go into the next part.
It's been pretty good. It's been pretty much no questions here. So you were saying I just have a funny question really. You were saying how the second would have to, like, if something goes wrong, your second would have to start executing people. So you should have a pretty
Oh, yeah.
eh?
Yeah, your second should show up armed. Like, it's... Right, the point, like, there are people there who are just kind of, like, officials, right? The doctor isn't going to kill people.
So
But yeah, part of the
like
point of the second...
your best fighting friend, essentially.
Yeah.
Are they?
Oh, very much so.
Do they usually bring like a firearm? Your second, like in Hollywood would.
I mean, it depends on the era, right? Like, if it's early 16th century, guns are less prevalent. Later period, they're more prevalent. The stuff we're talking about, right, you start to see some gun dueling in the 17th century, but isn't really happening a ton at this point. But, like, if, like, one guy... So, one of the things they're checking for a lot is, like, hidden weapons. So, if the other guy, like, pulls a knife out of his boot that we didn't agree everyone gets boot knives, the room is going to stop, and your second just gets to kill that
guy. That's cool.
Did women attend? I don't know off the top of my head. Right, the more private duels, probably not. Right, in these scenarios, it's more likely. It is important to note that, like, everyone in this picture is a dude. Part of this is because artists are very patriarchal, but add to that, this question's for me. Let me answer this question, and then Phil, if you can read the next ones for me, just I have PowerPoint up. Like, the public space is very mixed. This doesn't mean that women didn't work, right, both in and outside the household, but right, a lot of public life was very much limited to adult men. So I would be, like, the point you have 10,000 people watching, there's definitely going to be some women there. Where you have, like, 4 or 6 people, probably not.
So there's another question. Were there any times where a person of lower stature, to any degree, was able to challenge someone to a duel by a way of legal loophole or exception?
Yeah, so if you're of lower status, you can attempt to challenge someone of higher status to a duel. And we see this happen more often with, like, knives or daggers than we do with swords, right? Because if you're like, nowadays, your ability to own any particular object is largely defined by how much money you have and if your criminal record bars you from this thing. That's not how people in pre-modern times saw it, right? It would be like, this class is allowed to own these things. So, right, in, like, certain places, if you are of this status, you were not allowed to ride a horse in town, because then you would be higher than other people, and that's bad, right? You can have one on your farm, even though, like, they're incredibly expensive, right? It's essentially like your car, except it dies faster. But yes, like, there's rules like riding horses around. There's a ton of rules about who is and who isn't allowed to wear a sword that are very class-based. But yeah, if you're a lower status, someone of upper status can accept your challenge, but they're also just allowed to dismiss it as, like, some ruffian.
Okay. Another question. That was Aaron Medema, who just left. He's a mentor of mine who's also doing his dissertation on duels. So if you have any questions, you can throw some at him as well. On Facebook, he'll answer them. All right, so we have another question from Cameron. Sorry if I butchered that. Could you hire someone to fight for you? Would this
No.
be... Okay.
So you can't hire someone to fight for you. If you should, like, you could have your second there, and if you're like particularly ill or something, right? Part of their job is also step in and fight for you. But you can't just be like, well, I want to do this duel. I'm going to find the biggest, strongest person in town and have them do it for me. Like you weren't right. This was your honor. The point of it was right. Being honorable is more important than being a victor. So if you won dishonorably, socially, it was worse than having just lost and died. We see like a similar thing happen. So there's the Judicial Duel in like the 14th century, which they just made that god awful movie about, like Ridley Scott, which is like a different process than these kind of duels. But even back then, right, like trial by combat. I was just watching a thing about this. Like, isn't a thing you could just like hire anyone to do. You could have like your relative step in, but you can't just like hire the biggest, baddest gun. So no, you can't just hire people to fight duels for you.
Or else everybody would just be hiring Fiore. He wouldn't be selling books. He was just.
What you did do, if you're in Italy, is you hire people to fight your wars for you. For example, get the condottieri, because the Italians have lots of money and don't want to get stabbed, so they just have like tons of German and Swiss mercenaries fighting each other for them. It gets really funny because the mercenaries also figure out that dying is bad business, and there's like one battle that Machiavelli tells us of like 2 noblemen died. Like one of them fell off his horse and broke his neck, and like someone else like fell into a ditch or something. He doesn't like mention how many peasants died, but a lot of it was just like we're gonna move around and posture, and whoever has the better position wins. There's one instance where like people bring guns to one of those battles, and the other side just murders the crap out of them. They're like, hey, those could hurt someone. We don't want guns on our battlefield. Someone might die. So battles, right? But again, right, the dueling list is considered more honorable than the battlefield. So battles, hiring people fine. Duels, can't hire people.
Any questions? Last minute. Now's your chance. Or if you just want to say something, feel free.
Cool.
All right. That's it. Thank you, Arik, for doing this.
That was just the. I have another like. Oh, that was like 2/3 of it.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. How to Germany.
Germany. So most of this, the Italian stuff came from 2 different sources. Most of the German stuff is coming from this one singular book. It's really good. The Martial Ethic in Early Modern Germany by Anne Tlusty. So her big thing is like, hey, most of the literature on dueling has to do with the upper classes. Let's see what middle class people were doing. So a lot of this is defined based on citizenship. So citizenship, yeah, I mean, you want to find like a good master. I don't like. We have some knowledge. Like Marozzo lists the prices for his classes. And we know how much Filippo Dardi charged for fencing classes in Bologna in the 15th century. Outside of that, I don't know much about the economics of finding a fencing master, but I'm sure reputation has a lot to do with it. Cool. So Germany. So this is where like these kind of duels again are restricted, although a little less so. So this is based on who was a citizen. So my knowledge of Canadian history isn't great. Like in American history, so like when America gets founded in the 18th century, there's always talk about like democracy, but all the people allowed to vote are land-owning men, right? So again, if you're a woman, or if you're poor, or if you're a child, or if you're right, if you're First Nations, as Canadians call them, right, you didn't count. So this middle class dueling is like restricted to citizens, which is largely the aristocracy, but again, fairly narrow sliver of society. part of your job as a citizen, so if you lived in like Augsburg or like one of the cities, part of your duties were to own your own set of arms. This is like a tradition we see going back to even ancient Rome, but oftentimes you would need to like own a helmet, a breastplate, a sword, a pike, and then depending on the time, either a crossbow or a gun. Right, roughly every 3 weeks, you would take a turn as part of the town guard. The town guard served multiple functions. Part of it was like guard against outsiders. This is also in a time before we have a formalized, or before they have the idea of policing. So they're kind of the law enforcement. Add to that, they're also the fire department. Things light on fire a lot. This caused like a few issues here and there. Sometimes you'd be called in to break up this fight, but like this isn't your full-time job, and the guy in the fight is your best friend, and you're just going to help him out. Oftentimes these town guards were largely just drinking clubs. But, you know, there's idealized notion of like owning arms and like defending the city. As well, right, like the line between soldier and citizen, particularly in like the 30 Years' War, got really loose. Like the closest we have nowadays, particularly in countries that don't have a draft, is kind of jury duty. So think of it as like a every 3-week jury duty. But as part of it, you have like own your own supplies. Again, they excluded Jews from this because, as we've seen before, everybody hates the Jews. There's also, right, this idea of the sanctity of the household I talked about earlier. Like the doorway to your house was considered almost sacred. So just because the person isn't in the same room as you doesn't mean they can't start a fight. So one of the ways we often see these fights begin is like someone will like run a knife or a sword into the door of your house. Right? They're not expecting someone to stand in behind it, but it's essentially as if they're attacking you. So, right, upper middle class male citizens is who this is aimed at, but slightly larger than the aristocracy. So, for instance,
this is regarding your Italian section. If you have 40 days to train, was there competition to hire the best master? Money then win.
I addressed a little earlier. Yeah, you have like, we don't have a lot of records regarding that, so I don't have a ton to base my answer off of. Like, yeah, I'm sure they charge something. We have a couple records of what like Marozzo and what Filippo Dardi charged for lessons generally. I don't know if there's a special dueling rate. I'm sure reputation had a lot to do with who you went with, but otherwise, I don't know a ton about the economics of figuring out a last-minute fencing master. Anyhow, back to Germany. So we have Joachim Meyer, whose picture, right, this one on the left is from, for instance, right, was part of so his day job was not fencing master. His day job was that he was a cutler. He made knives. Right, and he did that as part of a guild, right, and lots of the fencing schools in Germany, so the Marksbrüders and the Freefechters, specifically, were attached to particular middle-class guilds. So these are the people learning how to fence and getting to these fights as well. So you see in Meyer's longsword section, which is a little more tournament-focused than just duel-focused, there's a lot of hitting with the flat of the sword. This isn't because the flat is the secret best part of the sword. This is because when you're hitting people in the hands and you're all craftsmen, breaking their hands with the edge of the sword, even a blunt sword, is real bad. Hitting them with the flat of the sword, less likely to break metacarpals. Add into this that the culture at the time is incredibly militaristic, right? There's a war going on. The line between citizen and soldier gets blurred. There's this idea in military circles that you should never be one to back down from a threat. This makes sense to a certain degree on the battlefield. For context, I have never served in any armed forces. I'm just reading books here. But like, if I have to get you to go, I'm your commanding officer, and I have to get you to go over this hill and attack someone, even though it's really scary, uh, it's helpful for me to like engender a culture of always charging forward and never backing down. This means, though, that when I take those same people and I bring them into larger society, and they have that idea of never back down from a threat, they're much quicker to fight. Add to that, there's also this idea, so I like to use the phrase tactical clothing. But in the way, like, people nowadays will wear like military camo or cargo pants or combat boots and stuff like that, if they haven't been in the military. They did the same thing in the 16th and 17th century, right? So militaristic ideals are so pervasive that they're making it into the fashion of people who've never been in a fight before. Again, we talk about honor culture. So the third one's kind of interesting. We have several accounts of men being uninterested in fighting for their honor and their wives telling them that they have to go do this. So like they just did like the new version of West Side Story, right? And there's this whole bit in there of like, nah, don't get into this brawl, like don't do this fight. It's not worth it, right? Like Tony, don't get killed. No, I have to do it. This was the opposite in like the 16th and 17th centuries, right? Where the women were the ones like pushing the men to go fight for the honor of the women. Inside of these fights, so these kind of fights, generally speaking, weren't like things you trained for and had 40 days. It was a little more spontaneous. But that does not mean that Phil insults me and then I instantly attack him. This means that Phil insults me, and similar to like a bar fight nowadays, where I might say like, let's step outside. There's still some fighting indoors, but like there's a little bit of a lead up. So just like with fights nowadays, there's rules to these fights if they aren't legal things. So it would be weird were I to get in a fight tomorrow. A, be weird for getting in a fight. But B, like if I bit someone, that would be seen as weird nowadays. Or if I kicked a man in the groin, right, that's seen as more cowardly than punching someone in the face and giving them concussion. Right, concussing people, perfectly fine. Groin kicking, less good. So there was rules back then. So for instance, like if the other person falls, so if I have read my mire and Chuck fell to the ground, I'm not going to the ground with him. I either stand back and wait for him to give up, because I just threw him at a bunch of like cobblestone that's going to hurt, or he gets up and then I fight him again. I'm not going to the ground. I'm also not hitting him while he's down there. As well, because everyone's wearing swords, or at least a messer, if I have knocked his sword out of his hand, whether intentionally or not, I can't then hit him with my sword. That's bad. He is defenseless at this point, and I can't take advantage of that. In the language we see describing some of this stuff, the aristocracy is trying to separate themselves from the middle class. So they're using the word, or I don't speak German, but essentially they're saying duel for the aristocratic fighting we saw earlier, and they're calling the middle class fighting a brawl, right? Kind of as a put down to people who are of lower social status than them. But that doesn't mean that they're particularly different affairs. It's mostly just who's doing it. This makes it like a little harder to do research. So you have to go look for fight a bunch, as opposed to just duel, which is a specific word. As well, right, the aristocracy by the early 17th century is very much trying to like monopolize, partly via duels, the idea that like they are the honorable class, as opposed to the peasantry. So like they're saying that theirs are affairs of honor, but like people who are like middle class craftsmen clearly had honor they had to defend as well. They're using different words for it. As well, right, the aristocracy, just like nowadays, we like to take care of their own. So if two aristocrats get into a fight with each other in Germany, even if dueling is illegal, which is generally much more illegal in Germany in this age than it is in Italy, it's just kind of let happen. They don't let, right, because the courts are for the public. So if two aristocrats are fighting, right, the judges aren't going to get in the middle of it, whereas the legal system is likely to care a bit more if someone else shows up. And again, right, this tension is because the economics are changing. You're the burghers, right, where we get the word bourgeoisie from, right, it starts in German and goes to French, right, where the merchant class is the one who now has all of the money, as opposed to just the land-owning noble class. So, dueling, definitely illegal. 100% not a thing you're allowed to do. Totally. There's not a lot of people getting prosecuted for dueling, though. Which is weird, because we have lots of accounts of duels. And you'd think that if there's lots of duels, and it's totally illegal, someone would go on trial, particularly if lots of people die. Right, you have accounts of, like, people mishandling firearms and killing someone and then getting put on trial. But otherwise, right, as long as it was just an honorable duel where the sides were evenly matched, like no one threw pocket sand at the other person, it was pretty okay. Right, there's a larger idea going on where the court's kind of going, all right, these young, hot-headed men, and again, this is specifically aimed at men, need a way to blow off steam and take risks. Right, the same way you see, like, we're seeing like people playing chicken while driving, or like folks just like barreling down the highway. Like, I've definitely been coming back from practice before, and like 3 or 4 cars will just be zipping at, like, I don't know kilometers very well, but 100 miles an hour, real fast. Right, they have to. There's this now, like, this agreed upon idea of like, cool, these guys have to do something really risky to prove themselves. And what we're going to not do is make this illegal. Because it's not that they're going to follow the law if we make this illegal, but they will find something, or if we make this legal, we make dueling legal, they'll be like, oh, well, that's not risky enough. We need something even riskier. So it was definitely illegal. Particularly in the military, it was a totally illegal thing for you to get in a duel with your fellow soldiers. It was also a thing the officers encouraged all of the time for you to do, because this makes it easier for you to charge over the hill. So a lot of the duels we have are from soldiers in the same army fighting each other. So this had to be a fair fight, right? There's a little less hullabaloo around it than the Italians, right? In the aristocratic duel, right? The aristocratic duel kind of starts in Italy and spreads north and west. So you didn't have 40 days; it just kind of happened. There wasn't always a like, we're going to get the swords out and measure them, right? In Italy, sometimes, like, if I was the wealthier of the two of us, sometimes I'd have to provide you with a weapon, or sometimes, right, there'd be the public armory that we would grab stuff from. Here, it's a little less that, but if we have some accounts, for instance, of I'm on a horse and I'm hitting you with a sword, and you're on foot and you're hitting me with a sword, I am dishonorable because I used a horse, and that's not fair. I should have gotten off the horse and fought you. So equally armed. The next thing, which is not a thing we deal with so much these days, but like kind of the Renaissance version of doping up your athletes, was putting magical talismans on your body. Folks were incredibly superstitious back then, and part of the thing, we see this both in Italy as well as Germany, is like sometimes you'd be inspected not only for hidden weapons, but also for magical talismans. or if I found that I had like paid someone to put a curse on my opponent and I won, people would look at me sideways. That would be bad. The other thing that we see, specifically in the German context, they really don't want you to thrust with the sword. I took this great class with Christian Tobler years ago. We talked about legality around using this or that part of the sword. So if my sword lives in my sheath, if I put my hand on my sword, right, I can do that and be like, hey, you should back off. If you're getting up in my face and you're causing some sort of threat, and kind of pull the sword out a bit and hit you with the pommel. Not going to kill you, kind of stun you. Right, there's ways of hurting, like killing people with a pommel strike, but like while my sword's in my sheath, that kind of jab isn't going to do it. If this person is really starting a fight with me and causing a problem, I can take my sword out, I can hit them with the flat of my sword. Again, like it will hurt, right? It's a piece of metal hitting me in the face, but I won't die. And even like with medicine where it was then, it's not going to kill me. If they're like actually coming at me and like swinging blows with like intent to harm me, I'm allowed to use the edge of my sword, right? This might hurt, like this will hurt. It might kill someone, but it also might not, right? I can cause surface wounds easier with a cut, especially like this is the Little Ice Age, so people are wearing like fairly thick clothing. So I can like definitely cut your arms, mess them up. But we don't, for instance, in like the Bolognese texts, which I'm more familiar with, there aren't one-handed cuts to the abdomen. So they're just not going to do much through a wool doublet. You see two-handed cuts, not really one-handed ones. A thrust, though, it doesn't really matter how much fabric you're wearing. The point of my sword will go through it like butter, and it will go into your organs, and it will be bad. So the Germans, particularly Meyer, really don't want you to thrust, not because thrusting is too Italian, like Silver talks about, but just because it's too dangerous, right? It will cause organ damage, and they don't have like there's no good way to treat that. So if I start thrusting in the middle of my duel, I'm going to be looked down upon by essentially cheating. Finally, the thing that's really important here is dying a good death. So even if Phil and I are walking into this fight as mortal enemies, if Phil kills me, right, part of his role as the duelist is to stay with me and then go forth from here. And even though he was trash talking me yesterday, tomorrow he's going to go off and tell of how great a gentleman I was and how upstanding I was. Right. He's going to say how I defended myself with honor, how I stood up for the right and the good, but that the fates weren't with me and that I lost. Right. This does him well, right? Because he's talking good about me, right? If he was like, oh, I was some punk and I want to hit him in the face, they're like, A, that's kind of rude, and B, like, what does it say about your skills if you just like beat up someone who doesn't know what they're doing? So, right, losing the fight but dying a good and honorable death here is more important than winning the fight dishonorably. So if I pulled out a hidden knife, or I beat him via magic, or I pocket sanded him and then won, even if I survived the encounter, like a second killing me, that's ultimately much, much worse for like for my standing in society than if I had died but have been respected while doing it. So that's what I got. If anyone wants to read a lot of books, here's a lot of books. I can also send this PowerPoint out if people want later. Some of them are articles. Yeah, for things. So a couple of these are fencing treatises, but like most of them are history books. Great. Anyhow, that's all I had prepared. If people have... Yeah, so Aunt Yuden, interesting story about him. So a few things. A, he isn't a duelist. He's like a wrestling coach. B, by the time that he is in the Austrian court, he's converted into Christianity. So he isn't Jewish by this time, but I haven't read his book. I've read just from his book on him. I don't believe we have accounts of him getting into duels. Right, he's having, wrestling to the medieval person is essentially like what hockey is to the Canadian person now, like what basketball is to the American. Like essentially, like you went to services, and afterwards you all wrestled in the field. Right, this was a thing everyone did all of the time for fun. So it was, and like you see a lot more class cross-pollination in wrestling because it isn't so much an affair of honor, even though like wrestling is used in affairs of honor, as opposed to like murdering someone with a sword in a one-on-one stylized fight is much more restricted, as opposed to like you have a lot of aristocrats trying to boast that they were able to throw a farm boy, even though they don't work with their hands all day long.
We're gonna open up some last questions. If anyone has any questions, now is your time to ask. Pocket sand. Yeah, that was
Chris, are you trying to ask a question? You're muted. Yep.
Pardon? Oh, let me unmute Kayla. There we go. Oh, she's saying pocket sand. What is that? Like what?
Oh, it's like so like it's a joke from a TV show, but like having like a bunch of sand in your pocket and whipping it out and throwing it at someone's eyes to blind them.
It's also in like one or two sources that you should carry a pocket full of sand to throw.
Yeah. Fiore at one point in his book explains how to make a pole arm that contains blinding powder. I can't tell. Fiore also the person he writes at least the Getty for. He's like, this true and honorable guy, and like this guy was a thug. Like the guy he's writing it for was essentially like a mercenary who just took over the town. So Fiore was like slightly a thug as well. But anyhow, yeah. So you can't just like blind people. It's bad. Even though Fiore does have a chapter on how to make blinding powder. Guy went through a couple articles on it.
Yeah, I mean you can use lamps too and other things that are written in other sources. Anyone have any other questions? This has been truly full of knowledge. I like this. This is good. We do have. Yeah. Justin is actually. If we're gonna have another discussion, if people are liking this lecture and discussion kind of presentation, we are gonna have another one. I want to start inviting some Canadian speakers as well. Notice the next speaker is another American, but that's okay. We like Americans. The next speaker is probably going to be Justin from Boston. I don't know what his topic is going to be yet. I don't think he knows it either because I haven't told him he's going to present. But he's all been told now. So he'll let us know. And I want to talk to Dorf as well and try to get a speaker from there as well as Toronto and Ottawa if I can get in contact with them. And I want to get a speaker from Montreal as well.
Yeah, just as like a final big picture thing before we wrap up, right? A lot of these, right? There's lots of ways in which people fought with swords. If you're doing HEMA, the books you're pulling from are essentially how to duel guides, right? It's people walking into a ring, or at least a scenario, with swords already drawn out of measure, generally with the same tool as the other person. Right, we occasionally do get talk about social versus asocial violence earlier. Chapters like Morozzo, as well as Fiore, have chapters on like, say someone pulls a knife on you and attacks you. Right, and this is for like in the pub or on the street. But when it comes to swords, unless it's a one on many kind of scenario, right? The people they're writing for are people in a honor and dueling culture.
Perfect. All right, thank you, Arik, and I truly appreciate you taking your time doing this. And again, thank you everybody for showing up. We will keep you posted on future lectures, and if anyone would like to come forth and speak, feel free to message me. Thank you again, and everybody have a good night and stay safe.
Will do. Thank you so much for
that. It was great.